Hi, I'm Katie with Howstuffinmycarworks.com. In today's video, I will explain how to replace an outer CV boot on a front-wheel drive passenger car. The vehicle used for this illustration is a 1989 Honda Accord, but these steps can be used as a general guideline for most front-wheel drive vehicles. The first step, as usual, is to disconnect the negative battery cable for safety. The next step is to raise the front end of the vehicle and place two jack stands under the subframe for safety. Make sure that the emergency brake is set and you have wheel chucks behind the rear wheels to keep the car from rolling. Depending on the drive axle design, you will either need a punch to open the axle nut where it meets with the groove on the axle, or you may need to remove the cotter pin to be able to remove the CV axle nut. Use an impact wrench if you have access to one. Otherwise, you may need to place a pry bar in between the wheel studs to keep the wheel from turning as you loosen the axle nut. This particular vehicle has the brake holes bolted to the strut and it needs to be detached by removing the retaining bolt as shown in the image. Hondas also have a damper fork connected to the lower control arm. Remove the bolt that connects them together. Next step, remove the cotter pin from the lower ball joint and loosen the nut until it is flush with the tip of the ball joint stud. Using a ball joint separator similar to the one on the image, separate the ball joint from the lower control arm. We removed the ball joint nut completely for clarity, but you need to perform this step with the nut loose and flush with the ball joint stud to avoid injury when the ball joint and lower control arm separate violently. Once the lower ball joint has been loosened from the lower control arm, remove the nut completely and using a pry bar, apply downward pressure on the control arm to separate it from the steering knuckle. Next, pull on the hub assembly as you push the outer end of the CV drive axle in to separate it from the hub bearing assembly. Use a pry bar to separate the axle from the transaxle. The axle is held in place by a snap ring. It is not necessary to apply excessive force to separate the axle, just a fast movement with the pry bar. Make sure you pull the axle straight out to avoid damaging the output shaft seal. Once the axle has been removed from the vehicle, place it on a vise. Using snip cutters, proceed to cut the boot clamps as shown in the picture. Next, cut the CV boot in half and remove it from the axle. Using a long brass punch and a hammer, tap on the inner part of the CV joint as shown in the image to release the CV joint from the snap ring. Next, remove the CV joint from the axle. Place the CV joint in a metal pan. Remove the old grease using gasoline and a brush. Spray the brake cleaner at the end to make sure that the part is clean and free from old grease. Dry the CV joint using compressed air. Next, pack the CV joint with the bag of grease provided with the new CV boot kit. Remove the old grease from the axle shaft and slide the new CV boot in with the small end going in first. Apply a light coat of grease to the splines on the axle shaft and proceed to install the CV joint. You will need to tap it with a hammer to slide it past the snap ring. To avoid damaging the tip of the axle, install the nut on and tap on it with a hammer when installing the CV joint back on the axle, or better yet, use the brass punch to tap on it back in place. Next, install the CV boot on the CV joint. Install the new clamps provided with the CV boot kit. If you don't have CV boot clamp pliers, you can use locking pliers as shown in the image. Once the clamp has been installed and tightened properly, proceed to bend the other tabs in. Tap on them with a hammer to make sure that they are tight. Trim the excess off the CV boot clamp. Lubricate the transmission output shaft seal with a light coat of grease prior to installing the axle back on. Apply a light coat of anti-seize to the axle splines. Also, install the axle back on the car and proceed to install the remaining components in the reverse order they were removed. Make sure that you tighten all the bolts properly. Tighten the axle nut to proper spec. This particular vehicle requires the axle nut to be torqued at 137 foot-pounds. It also requires the use of a punch to bend the end of the axle nut into the groove on the axle to keep it from coming loose. If your vehicle takes a cotter pin, make sure you install a new one. Once you are done installing the parts back on the vehicle, install the wheel back on and lower the vehicle to the ground. Make sure that the wheel lug nuts are tightened properly. Add transmission fluid if needed, and take the vehicle for a test drive. As you can see, replacing an outer CV boot on a CV axle is quite simple. I want to thank you for watching this video and encourage you to subscribe to our channel. We film new videos every week. Also, don't forget to visit our online store. We have a great selection of car, truck, and SUV accessories. Again, I am Katie, and I look forward to seeing you again on my next video.